Today we are going to take a close look at the inscriptions of Asoka, the Mauryan ruler, in fact the greatest ruler of the Maurya dynasty in 3rd century BC. Why Asoka's inscriptions in particular? The answer is, with Asoka's inscriptions begins the tradition of epigraphy in early Indian history. We do have inscribed records of the Harappan civilization, but these are as yet not deciphered. So the continuation of the epigraphic tradition starts with Asoka, and that's why it is a very important aspect of Indian epigraphic tradition, and the inscriptions of Asoka are perhaps the most reliable and the best guide to understand the historical significance of his rule spanning over nearly 4 decades. It is true that Asoka is known from a number of Buddhist texts. He is a very major figure in Buddhist tradition, but the Buddhist texts were actually written much later than the time of Asoka, while the inscriptions definitely belonged to his reign period and were actually issued under his direct instruction. So this is a great advantage of looking at the reign period of one of the greatest rulers in Indian history through absolutely contemporary epigraphic records. In another way, these are unique records because Asoka here speaks directly in first person to his subjects and to the functionaries of his state. These records, interestingly, are written in 3 different languages, mostly in Prakrit language, in greater parts of the subcontinent. Of course, this Prakrit has many regional linguistic variations. But in the northwestern borderland of the subcontinent, starting from, say, Taxila region, now in Pakistan, to several parts of Afghanistan, Asoka issued inscriptions in 2 non-Indian languages and scripts. These languages and scripts are Greek and Aramaic. Aramaic is a Semitic West Asiatic language and script. The Brahmi inscriptions of Asoka are written in 2 scripts. The Prakrit inscriptions have 2 scripts, one in Brahmi, which is the mother of all Indian major scripts of today, and also Kharoshthi, which are mainly limited to the northwestern part of his territory. And this is a script which is written from left to right. That is quite different from Brahmi, which is written from left to right. And along with the use of Brahmi and Kharoshthi scripts, Asoka also employed Greek and Aramaic scripts for inscriptions written in Greek and Aramaic languages. So earlier, the image was Asoka was mainly issuing his records in Prakrit language and in 2 scripts. Now, with the discovery of as many as 7 inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic, we know he issued inscriptions in 3 languages and 4 scripts, immediately indicating the diversity of cultural situations during his time. Now let us look at what these inscriptions tell us about Asoka in person, about the political scenario of his time, and also why it is so important a clue to understand the nature of the Maurya power during his time. When these inscriptions were first discovered and deciphered, they recorded the name of a ruler, Devanam Piyapiyadasi Raja, in Prakrit language, indicating that this was a ruler who in Sanskrit would appear as Devanam Priya Priyadarshi Raja, that is, one ruler who was beloved of the gods and also of beautiful looks. He was a king. Now his identity was a major historical debate and problem. Who this ruler was, after all, this expression only speaks of a title, an epithet. But what is the identity of this ruler? That was solved with the discovery of an inscription of Asoka in the area of Maski in present-day Karnataka, which, along with this epithet and the title, also carried his personal name, Devanam Piyapiyadasi Raja, Asoka, which would stand in Sanskrit Ashoka. This was a very major discovery in making absolutely clear identification of the Devanam Priyadarshi Raja in inscriptions with the Mauryan ruler Asoka, who is already known through Buddhist texts. In more recent decades, similar Ashokan edicts found from Gujarat in Madhya Pradesh and from Nittur in Karnataka have also revealed his personal name Asoka. So the problem of identification is gone, and Devanam Piyapiyadasi Raja is none but Asoka himself, the third ruler of the Maurya dynasty. Now with him begins the first recorded documents issued by a ruler for communicating various ideas, instructions, policies to his subjects and to his functionaries of the realm. In most of the English works on Asoka and his inscriptions, you would come across the use of the term Asoka's edicts. Why not Asoka's inscriptions? Because most of these inscriptions actually carry promulgations, administrative measures, proclamations which needed to be followed, obeyed by his subjects and by his officers. That's why the term edict is a more apt expression rather than inscriptions. There are, of course, a few inscriptions of Asoka which were not edicts or promulgations. And for these, you can use the term Asokan inscriptions, but most of his inscriptions are edicts. There are very clear categories of Asoka's inscriptions which are found over very major areas of the Indian subcontinent and also, now we know, also in parts of Afghanistan. There are very large number of Asokan inscriptions available, and these belong to these following categories. We have 14 Rok Edicts, also called major Rok Edicts. There are also 2 sets of minor Rok Edicts. Now, the difference between the major Rok Edicts and the minor Rok Edicts are simply in size. The major Rok Edicts are extensive statements issued by or at the instruction of Asoka. The content of the minor Rok Edicts are shorter in size. Now, apart from these, we have 7 pillar edicts or major pillar edicts which are inscribed on the tall, standing, freestanding, monolithic pillars of Asoka, so famous. Similarly, there are minor pillar edicts, and the difference, once again, like the major Rok Edict and the minor Rok Edict, is the size. The major pillar edicts or the pillar edicts are longer, more elaborate in statement, and the minor pillar edicts are shorter in size. Now, apart from these, we also have minor pillar inscriptions, which are not his edicts, like the inscriptions found at Nigalisagar in close to Nepali Starai, and also the inscription at Rummindei, that is Lumbini Grama, the place of the nativity of the Buddha. We have a particular type of Rok Edict from Bhabra, that is in Rajasthan, close to Bairat or Jaipur area. There are also inscriptions attached to Ashoka's, the name of Ashoka's queen, which are called queen's inscriptions. And Ashoka also has an inscription at Barabar cave area near Gaya, where he dedicated some cave shelters to Ajivika monks. These are not edicts. Now, apart from these, all these records are written in Brahmi and Kharoshti scripts, and also in Prakrit language. It is from around 1970, and particularly since 1984, we begin to know that Ashoka's inscriptions are found, technically speaking, outside the subcontinent, and these come mostly from Afghanistan. There are 7 such records written in Aramaic and Greek language, and there are also Greco-Aramaic bilingual biscriptural inscriptions. Now, these Greek and Aramaic records were made for a very particular region of Ashoka's empire, that is essentially the northwestern borderlands of the subcontinent, where of course people would be more familiar with Greek and Aramaic languages and scripts. And these inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic were written either by paraphrasing, summarizing, combining the texts of Ashoka's principal inscriptions in Prakrit language strewn over greater parts of the subcontinent. Now, this is an interesting process. It immediately suggests that there were principal drafts of his messages, which of course traveled to distant parts of the subcontinent and into Afghanistan, where according to the local needs, the officers under Ashoka prepared necessary versions in Greek and Aramaic languages and scripts. Sometimes there are transliterations of the Prakrit words and expressions. Let us take an example. Ashoka's political title is Raja, which means a king. In Aramaic, this term is exactly translated as Malka, which is almost like present-day Malik, meaning a lord, the king. And in Greek, once again an exact translation, Basileos. So we can find the process of inscribing in Greek and Aramaic languages based on the Prakrit drafts of his most of the inscription undergoes a process of transliteration, sometimes translation, sometimes summary, and we shall see gradually how in some cases certain terms were explained, elaborated, and also sort of glossed upon. He is not mentioning the time of his accession to the throne, but the more important marker of timing is his actual coronation, Ovisheka. And as we know from the Buddhist text, there was possibly a gap of 4 years between his accession to the throne and his actual coronation, which, formally speaking, legitimizes his position as a ruler. It is likely that Ashoka came to the throne, succeeding his father Bindusara in about 273 BC. So, his coronation possibly took place about 269 BC. Ashoka mentions in his Rok Edict 13 5 of his contemporary Yavana or Greek rulers far away from his realm. These were Antiochus Theos of Syria, and then we come across Ptolemaios or Ptolemy Philadelphos of Egypt, Antekina or Antigonus Gonatas of Macedonia, then Maga or Megas of Cyrene, and Alikasudara or Alexander, not Alexander the invader from Macedonia, but this Alexander is Alexander of Epirus. Now all these Greek rulers' chronologies are pretty well known in the study of Hellenistic polities of West Asia and North Africa. So if these rulers were contemporaries of Asoka, Asoka cannot be removed in time of date far from these rulers. So our understanding is that Asoka ruled contemporary to these 5 rulers, whose dates are pretty well known. I'm not getting into the nitty-gritties of this chronology, but now we are more or less sure that he was enjoying a fairly long reign of 40 years, nearly about 4 decades, spanning from circa 273 BC to 232 BC. These are momentous years in Indian history. Perhaps the most important political event of his reign is the Kalinga War. The Rok Edict 13 gives a graphic description of the terrible violence that was unleashed during the conquest of Kalinga. Asoka gives very vivid details, not once but at least twice or thrice in this record, that a large number of people in Kalinga were slain, many people died, and even larger number of people were forcefully deported during the war and after the defeat of Kalinga and annexation of Kalinga into the Mauryan Empire. This event, the violent clash in Kalinga, leading to terrible human miseries, brought genuine remorse in the Mauryan emperor's mind. He categorically speaks of his anutapa, his deep sense of remorse at having unleashed terrible violence during the conquest. But interestingly, in the same inscription, he also records that when an unconquered territory is conquered, this kind of misfortune could happen. 2 things emerge from this. One, that Kalinga before the campaign of Asoka was, at least to Asoka's view, an unconquered territory, which was fit to be conquered by military expedition. And then he's almost indicating at the inevitability of horror and violence when an unconquered territory is being conquered. Nobody questions his deep sense of genuine remorse, but he also underlines that this kind of terrible scenario during a conquest is perhaps inevitable. But as we know, the Kalinga War is perhaps the last conquest made by a Mauryan ruler. It led to the greatest expansion of the Mauryan realm. Asoka, in deep remorse, categorically declared that he is eschewing the policy of war, of aggressive campaigns and annexation after Kalinga War. This is a great moment, not only in Indian history, but also almost in universal history. This is one rare case where a ruler gives up war not in defeat, but after victory. True to his policy, he gives a war, But the Mauryan realm is already a very expansive one. And that is best indicated by the geographical distribution of Ashoka's edict on a map. The interesting part is all these inscriptions are, as we have said, administrative promulgations. So wherever he instructed the engraving of his messages, either on rock faces or on pillars, it is logical to assume that those areas were under his jurisdiction, political and administrative jurisdiction. Now, if we look at this, without going into the details, we can see it in a map that the greater parts of the subcontinent, stretching from Afghanistan in the northwestern area to Karnataka in the south, and from Kathiawar Peninsula to Kalinga, Orissa, if not also possibly some parts of undivided northern part of Bengal, formed part of his realm. Inscriptions of Ashoka are found within this vast zone. All types of inscriptions, that is, major rock edicts, minor rock edicts, major pillar edicts, minor pillar edicts, the edict from Bhabra, inscriptions of his queens, his inscriptions about his inscriptions to prevent schism within the Sangha. All these are found within this vast area. Within this, Pataliputra was, of course, his capital. Now, if we look into this scenario, it gives, in terms of the geographical distribution of Ashoka's inscription, that he was ruling over an area almost covering the greater parts of the subcontinent, except the areas to the south of Karnataka, covering present-day Tamil Nadu, some parts of eastern parts of Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, and also Kerala. Definitely, Sri Lanka is outside his jurisdiction. Now, this comes in close correspondence to what Ashoka actually speaks about his own realm. He is very clear that his realm is vast. In Rok Edict 14, he very emphatically says that his realm is vast. Mahalake hi vijitam. Even after giving up war and bringing about general peace, he did not stop at considering his territories as conquered territories. That is, the empire was carved out of military conquests and annexation. This is very clearly recognized by him by using the term Vijita as a synonym for his realm. The other term he uses is Raja Vishaya, meaning royal domain. Now here, Vijita, Raja Vishaya are synonymous terms. Ashoka also used two other interesting expressions, in fact names. He uses the word Jambudvipa to denote his realm. This is the earliest known epigraphic use of the term Jambudvipa, which is quite popular in later Puranic literature. To Ashoka goes the credit of using for the first time the name Jambudvipa, at least in inscriptions in Indian history. He also uses a term called Pathivi or Prithvi. He says that throughout the Prithvi or Pathivi, he has instructed dissemination of his messages through his edicts. This Pathivi or Prithvi obviously does not stand literally for the entire world, because Ashoka did not rule over the entire world. So his Pathivi or Prithvi actually stands for his realm, over which he distributed his edicts to disseminate his instructions and his message. This is for the first time certain names, nomenclatures, designations were designed by an imperial authority to use as synonym for a geopolitical unit. This is almost a nearly subcontinental authority. Now, Asoka's inscriptions tell us something more. He is not only very clear about what is his conquered area over which he rules, Vijita, or what is the royal domain, that is Raja Vishaya, he also is very conscious that which areas lie beyond his realm, which he calls Anta Avijita, Anta in the sense of frontier, borders, that there are certain areas or people or certain kings who are beyond the borders of his realm. He also called them as Prachanta, that is Pratyanta, once again meaning the border or the frontier area. What are these areas? He mentions categorically twice in Rok Edict 2 and Rok Edict 13 that Cholas, that is the area in the deep south of India, in the Kaveri Valley and Kaveri Delta, the Pandyas, also in the deep south, that is present in Madurai region in Tamil Nadu, the Satyaputras, that is in the southernmost part of Karnataka and the adjoining northern part of Tamil Nadu, and Keralaputra, that is the region of Kerala in southeastern part of India, and Tamrapadni, that is Sri Lanka, are outside his realm, forming Anta Avijita or Pratyanta area. Unconquered frontiers. He also mentions the 5 Greek rulers, Yavana Raja or Yona Rajas. In none of the areas which are mentioned as Anta Avijita or outside his realm, beyond his frontiers, in none such areas we have got any Asoka's inscriptions. So what are in Asoka's understanding, the areas comprising his Vijita Raja Vishaya area, only precisely from that area we get his inscriptions. So the external evidence of the physical find spots of his inscriptions actually match the internal evidence of his own understanding of the size of his empire, the areas which lie outside his authority. Now we know it is stretching from, as I have already said, and it requires a repetition, from Afghanistan in the northwest to Karnataka in the south, and from Gujarat to Kalinga, if not northern part of undivided Bengal. This is a pan-Indian paramount political power ruling almost over the entire subcontinent except the deep south and also perhaps the area lying to the east of what is undivided northern part of Bengal.